There are men who serve evil regimes with total dedication and absolute loyalty for years, who climb to the very top of the most feared organization in the most murderous state in modern history, who attend the meetings where the decisions to murder millions of people are made, who send the telegrams and sign the orders and manage the bureaucracy of mass killing with the calm efficiency of a senior corporate executive, and who then, when they sense that the whole project is about to collapse, quietly pick up the phone and call the enemy and offer to make a deal. Karl Wolff was one of those men. He was Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant for years, the man who stood at Himmler's right hand and managed the day-to-day operations of the SS empire at the height of its power. He was present at the meetings where the final solution was discussed. He received the telegrams reporting the progress of the death camps and responded to them with bureaucratic politeness. And then, in the final months of the war, he walked into a meeting with Allen Dulles, the head of American intelligence operations in Switzerland and the future director of the CIA, and offered to surrender all German forces in Italy in exchange for his own survival. The Americans took the deal. Hitler nearly had him shot when he found out. And Karl Wolff spent the rest of his life navigating the consequences of having been, simultaneously, one of the most senior figures in the SS and the man who secretly betrayed it. Karl Wolff was born on May 13, 1900, in Darmstadt, into a comfortable middle-class German family that gave him a conventional bourgeois upbringing and a conventional bourgeois education interrupted by the First World War, in which he served as a junior officer and experienced the same combination of military pride and national humiliation that shaped the political psychology of an entire generation of young German men. He emerged from the war with a lieutenant's rank, a sense that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated, and no particularly clear idea of what to do with himself in the chaotic and economically unstable Germany of the early Weimar years. He tried banking. He tried business. He joined various right-wing veterans organizations of the kind that proliferated in Germany in the 1920s as demobilized soldiers looked for community and political purpose in a country that seemed to be falling apart around them. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS shortly afterward, and he rose through the SS hierarchy with a speed that reflected both his genuine administrative ability and the particular skills he brought to an organization that was expanding rapidly and needed men who could manage complexity and present a polished and professional face to the world. Wolff was tall, handsome, well-dressed, and charming in the way that senior SS officers were expected to be, projecting an image of aristocratic competence that Himmler valued highly in the men around him. He became Himmler's personal adjutant in 1933 and remained in that position for nearly a decade, which meant that he was at the center of SS power throughout the period when the organization transformed itself from a personal bodyguard into the dominant security and terror apparatus of the Nazi state. Being Himmler's adjutant meant being present at everything. It meant traveling with Himmler, attending his meetings, managing his correspondence, coordinating between the SS and the other power centers of the Nazi state, and serving as the public face of Himmler's office in dealings with other senior Nazi figures. It meant knowing everything that was going on in the SS empire, which by the late 1930s meant knowing about the concentration camps, the security operations, the racial policies being implemented across occupied Europe, and the planning for what would eventually become the systematic murder of the European Jews. Wolff knew. He was there. He was not an ignorant bystander who happened to be standing near power, without understanding what that power was doing. He was an informed and active participant in the management of the SS at the highest level throughout the period when its crimes were being planned and executed. The evidence of his direct involvement in the Holocaust is unambiguous and was documented at Nuremberg and in subsequent trials. In 1942, Wolff received a report from the head of the Reich Railways informing him that trains were now available to transport Jews to the extermination camps at a rate of 5,000 people per day. Wolff wrote back, expressing his personal pleasure at this news and his gratitude for the efforts being made to facilitate the transportation. 5,000 people per day. He was pleased about it. He wrote it down and signed it and sent it back through the mail like a man thanking a colleague for resolving a scheduling problem. That letter survived the war, and it destroyed any possibility that Wolff could credibly claim after 1945 that he had not known what was happening or had not been involved in it. In 1943, Himmler sent Wolff to Italy as the supreme SS and police leader following the Allied invasion of Sicily and the overthrow of Mussolini. This was a significant command, making Wolff responsible for SS and police operations throughout the Italian peninsula at a time when Germany was trying to hold Italy against the Allied advance, while simultaneously dealing with Italian partisan resistance and continuing the implementation of Nazi racial policies in the newly occupied Italian territories. Wolff oversaw the deportation of Italian Jews to the extermination camps. He managed the brutal anti-partisan operations in which Italian civilians were massacred in reprisal for resistance activities. He was the senior SS officer in Italy, and he exercised that command with the thoroughness and efficiency that his career in the SS had trained him to apply to whatever task he was given. But Italy also gave Wolff something that his previous career had not given him, which was distance from Berlin and from Himmler, and from the daily supervision of the SS High Command. And with that distance came a degree of independent judgment that a man in his position had rarely been able to exercise before. And as 1944 turned into 1945, and the military situation became increasingly clear to anyone who was paying attention, Wolff began to think about what came next. He was a senior SS general in a country that was going to lose the war. He had signed letters expressing his pleasure at the transportation of Jews to death camps. He had overseen deportations and massacres. He was going to face a reckoning when the war ended, and he knew it, and the question was what he could do about it. What he did about it was to make contact with Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was running the Office of Strategic Services Station in Bern, Switzerland, which made him the senior American intelligence officer in Central Europe and one of the most important intelligence figures of the entire war. He was a sophisticated and pragmatic man who understood that intelligence work required the ability to deal with morally compromised individuals and to make calculations that were not always comfortable. And when word reached him through intermediaries in early 1945 that Karl Wolff, the SS commander in Italy, was interested in discussing a possible surrender of German forces in Italy, Dulles was interested enough to pursue it. The first meeting between Wolff and Dulles took place in March 1945 in Zurich, arranged through a network of intermediaries that included Italian industrialists and Swiss intelligence contacts. Wolff came to the meeting in civilian clothes without his SS uniform and presented himself as a pragmatic military commander who wanted to end the war in Italy and prevent further unnecessary destruction. He offered to arrange the surrender of all German forces in Italy, approximately 1 million men, in exchange for guarantees regarding his own treatment after the war. He did not explicitly ask for immunity from prosecution, but the implication was clear, and Dulles understood it perfectly. Wolff was offering something of genuine strategic value, and he wanted something in return. Dulles reported the contact to Washington, and the negotiations proceeded through March and April 1945 under the codename Operation Sunrise. The talks were conducted in extreme secrecy because what Wolff was proposing was a separate surrender of German forces in Italy without the knowledge or agreement of the Soviet Union, which was a matter of enormous political sensitivity given that the United States and the Soviet Union were still formally allies. Stalin found out about the talks and sent furious messages to Roosevelt accusing the Americans of negotiating a separate peace behind Soviet backs, which produced a famous and heated exchange between Roosevelt and Stalin in the final weeks of Roosevelt's life. The talks continued anyway. Hitler found out about Wolff's contacts with the Americans through his own intelligence sources and summoned Wolff to Berlin in April 1945 for a confrontation that could easily have ended with Wolff being shot. Hitler was in the Führerbunker by this point, conducting the final fantasy war of his imagination, while the Red Army closed in on Berlin from the east, and he was in no mood to hear that one of his senior SS generals had been secretly meeting with the enemy. The meeting between Hitler and Wolff in April 1945 was one of the most extraordinary encounters of the entire war. A conversation between a man who still believed he could somehow reverse the course of history and a man who had already decided that history was over and was trying to position himself for what came after. Wolff managed to convince Hitler that his contacts with Dulles had been an intelligence operation designed to deceive the Americans rather than a genuine surrender negotiation, a lie of breathtaking audacity delivered to the most dangerous man in Europe at a moment when the wrong answer meant immediate death. Hitler believed him, or at least pretended to believe him, and Wolff left Berlin alive. The German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2, 1945, several days before the general German surrender on May 8th, in what was the first large-scale German surrender of the war, and represented a genuine achievement for Operation Sunrise in terms of ending the fighting in Italy and potentially saving lives on both sides. Wolff had delivered what he promised. The question was whether the Americans would deliver what he needed. After the war, Wolff was held by the Allies and gave extensive testimony at Nuremberg, where his cooperation with Allied prosecutors and his insider knowledge of the SS High Command made him a valuable witness. He provided information about Himmler and about the SS leadership that was used in the prosecution of other defendants. And he benefited from what can only be described as a degree of protection from American intelligence that reflected the value of what he had provided through Operation Sunrise and his testimony at Nuremberg. He was not prosecuted at Nuremberg. He was released from Allied custody in 1949 after a German denazification court sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor, most of which he had already served while in custody, and he walked free into post-war West Germany. He spent the 1950s living quietly in West Germany, working in advertising and public relations, which in retrospect seems almost too perfect for a man whose entire career had been built on the projection of image and the management of appearances. He gave occasional interviews in which he presented himself as a moderate figure within the SS, who had ultimately done the right thing by negotiating the Italian surrender, and he maintained this version of his story with the same polished competence he had brought to everything else in his life. West German prosecutors began investigating him in the late 1950s and the letter about the train transports, the one in which he had expressed his personal pleasure at the availability of trains to take 5,000 Jews per day to the death camps, was central to the case against him. He was arrested in 1962 and tried before a Munich court in 1964. The prosecution presented the evidence of his direct involvement in the deportation of Jews and his role in the SS hierarchy during the years when the final solution was being implemented. The defense argued that his role in Operation Sunrise demonstrated that he had ultimately worked against the Nazi regime, and that his cooperation with Allied authorities after the war merited consideration in sentencing. The court convicted him and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. He served less than 4 years before being released in 1969 on grounds of poor health. He was 69 years old, and he lived for another 15 years, dying in 1984 at the age of 84. He gave interviews in his later years in which he continued to present Operation Sunrise as his defining achievement and his personal redemption, the act that proved he had been something more than simply another SS general serving the machinery of murder. He never fully acknowledged the weight of that letter about the trains. He never fully reckoned with what it meant that he had been pleased about 5,000 people per day being transported to their deaths and had written it down and signed it. Karl Wolff was not the worst man in the SS. There were men in that organization whose crimes were more direct and more personal and more numerous than his. But he was one of the most senior, one of the most informed, and one of the most complicit, and the deal he made with Allen Dulles saved him from the full consequences of that complicity in a way that the victims of the crimes he facilitated never got to experience. They did not get deals. They did not get to negotiate their survival in a hotel room in Zurich. They got the trains that Karl Wolff was so pleased to hear about in the summer of 1942. That is the story of Karl Wolff. The SS general who betrayed Hitler made a deal with the CIA and almost got away with everything. And now you know it.